Jason stepped into the office, feeling the cold blast of air from the AC immediately snake through his collar. It was his second day working in the new department, and he still wasn't used to the fast pace and the strange silence that seemed to hang over the place. Glances from co-workers flickered briefly toward him, but no one truly engaged. Heads remained bowed, eyes glued to computer screens, fingers typing away as if everything was more important than his presence. Jason sat down at desk number 12, tucked away at the end of the row near the window. He hadn't paid much attention to it yesterday, but this morning something felt off. His computer screen was already on, even though he was sure he had shut it down before leaving. The mouse was angled strangely, and the pen he always kept neatly beside it now lay askew on the desk. "Good morning," he called out, trying to break the oppressive quiet. He was met with little more than a few distracted nods from nearby colleagues. A blonde woman 2 desks away gave him an odd look, like she wanted to say something, but she quickly turned back to her screen, typing furiously. Jason tried to focus on his tasks, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been messing with his things. When he opened the drawer, everything seemed to be in place, except for one thing, a piece of paper with a hastily scrawled message that read, "Be careful. Who had left it, and why?" He frowned and reached out to straighten everything on his desk. "Maybe I just misremembered," he told himself, but a small wave of unease rose inside him. By lunchtime, Jason decided to get up and grab some coffee. When he returned, he stopped short in front of his desk. His chair was no longer where he had left it. It had been pushed back as if someone had just sat there. He glanced around the office. His co-workers, about a dozen of them, were still engrossed in their work. A few looked up as he walked past, but quickly turned their attention back to their screens. "Did someone come by my desk?" Jason asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few people lifted their heads, their eyes briefly meeting his before they shook their heads. No one said a word. The blonde woman sitting nearby shrugged and gave him a faint smile, as if his question didn't matter. A chill ran down Jason's spine. No one seemed to care, but their glances, fleeting, strange, almost secretive, left him with the distinct feeling he was being watched. It all started with an email that appeared in Jason's inbox early in the morning. The subject line simply read, "Good morning." The body of the email was blank, no signature, no information to identify the sender. Jason didn't think much of it, assuming it was either a system glitch or a misdirected message. But as more emails arrived, things started to get strange. The messages were short, almost unnervingly personal. "You like your coffee black, don't you?" Or, "Don't forget your jacket today, it's cold out." These lines seemed to know his daily habits all too well. At first, Jason thought it might be a prank by one of his co-workers, but when he brought it up during lunch, his team looked genuinely confused, shaking their heads and insisting they had no idea what he was talking about. After work that day, Jason returned to his desk and noticed something odd. Sitting on his desk was a photograph of himself, taken from an obscure angle. In the photo, he was focused on his computer, a black coffee on the desk in front of him, just like every day. He picked up the photo, flipping it over to search for any clues, but there was nothing except a scrawled note on the back. "Working hard, aren't you?" A cold shiver ran down Jason's spine. He looked around the office, searching for a smirk or a knowing glance, but everyone seemed absorbed in their work as usual. After that day, the emails became even more specific. One message read, "Your window is dirty." Startled, Jason turned to the window beside his desk. Sure enough, there was a faint smudge on the glass, as if someone had pressed their hand against it from the outside. Jason reported the strange emails to IT, but they told him the sender's address was too vague to trace. They suggested it might be spam or a harmless prank, but the odd occurrences didn't stop there. One day, Jason discovered his desk drawer was locked. He didn't recall locking it, and the key was still in his pocket. When he finally opened it, he found a pen he had never seen before and a small slip of paper that read, "Do you really think you're not being watched?" This time, Jason knew for sure someone was targeting him. But who? And why? He had no answers. The events slowly began to chip away at his nerves. Jason started scrutinizing everything around him. The glances from his co-workers, the unfamiliar clicking of a keyboard across the room, even the faint sound of footsteps when he stayed late at the office. All of it made him feel like he was surrounded by something he couldn't explain, something that was closing in. Jason returned to his apartment late one evening, the dim yellow glow from the hallway lights guiding him to his familiar space. As he fumbled with his keys to unlock the door, he felt the unmistakable sensation of someone watching him. Turning around, his eyes landed on the light from an apartment across the street, on the third floor, just far enough away to make out vague details. The light in that unit was always on whenever he got home. At first, he didn't think much of it, but after a few days, it started to gnaw at him. No matter when he arrived, early or late, that apartment light was always on, and through its large window, he could make out a shadowy figure behind thin curtains, standing still, as if watching him. Jason pulled his own curtains closed, hoping to block it out. But the next morning, something strange happened. When he woke up, he noticed his curtains had been pulled slightly open, exposing his room to the outside. A wave of unease washed over him as he stood by the window. He was certain he had closed the curtains tightly before going to bed. He checked the window. It was still locked from the inside. There were no signs of a break-in. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That evening, he tried to ignore the apartment across the street. But curiosity got the better of him, and he pulled the curtains aside to take another look. The shadowy figure was still there. This time, however, it wasn't standing still. The silhouette moved slowly, pacing back and forth behind the curtains, as if searching for something. Jason told himself it was probably just a neighbor going about their evening. But the discomfort lingered. He decided to test his theory. He stood by his window, staring directly at the apartment across the street. If it was just a coincidence, the figure wouldn't notice. But it did. The shadow froze immediately, as if it, too, was watching him. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He quickly closed the curtains and stepped back, trying to convince himself it was nothing. The light in the apartment across the street stayed on every night after that. One evening, Jason decided to investigate further. He stepped onto his balcony, squinting to get a clearer view. But now the curtains in the other apartment were drawn more tightly, as though whoever was inside wanted to block him from seeing anything. One night, as Jason was getting ready for bed, he heard a faint sound coming from his window. It was a tapping noise, soft and rhythmic. He didn't want to believe it, but as he approached the window, the sound repeated, steady and deliberate. Heart racing, he yanked the curtain open. There was nothing outside, just the dark night and the empty street below. Jason didn't know what was happening, but the light from the apartment across the street remained as bright as ever, casting its glow into his own room. This time, he turned off his lights and stood silently in the darkness, peeking through a small gap in the curtains. He saw no shadow, no figure behind the curtains. But he knew, deep down he knew, someone over there was watching him. Jason began noticing a subtle shift in his co-workers' behavior. Every time he walked into the office, conversations would abruptly stop, and a heavy silence would settle over the room. Quick glances, hushed whispers behind his back, and faint, cryptic smiles left him feeling like the center of a joke he wasn't in on. One day, during lunch, Jason decided to confront a group of co-workers gathered near the coffee machine. "Why does everyone keep looking at me like that?" he asked, his voice firm but tinged with frustration. They laughed, but their response wasn't exactly reassuring. "Jason, you're overthinking it," one of them said. "We're just worried about you, that's all." The comment was casual, even dismissive, but it only made Jason feel worse. What had he done to draw this strange attention? The odd occurrences didn't stop. One morning, Jason arrived at work to find his phone set to record. He had no memory of doing this himself. Stranger still, the saved audio file was titled Secret. When he played it, it was mostly static and ambient noise, except for a faint sound at the end, a single soft breath. Jason started losing sleep. Night after night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what was happening. Was it all in his head, or was someone truly watching him? Things escalated one morning when Jason found a small envelope on his desk. Inside was a single piece of paper with a handwritten note that read, "Do you know what they're saying about you?" He immediately scanned the room, but no one seemed to notice or care. His unease grew into full-blown paranoia. He began questioning everything. His co-workers' glances from across the room, the way they seemed to quickly look away when he caught them staring. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were silently observing him, as though he were the subject of some twisted game he wasn't aware of. One night, while working late, Jason heard faint laughter coming from the corner of the office. When he turned, the room was empty. The laughter faded, replaced by soft, deliberate footsteps that seemed to come from directly behind him. His heart racing, Jason shot up from his chair and ran into the hallway, but there was no one there, only the hum of the air conditioning and the dim glow of overhead lights. Jason began to feel trapped between two worlds. The tangible reality of what he could see, hear, and feel, and the growing fear that none of it was real. Was someone truly targeting him, or was his mind unraveling under the weight of his own paranoia? Either way, one thing became clear. Jason was losing his grip on his co-workers, on his life, and most terrifyingly, on his own sanity. Pushed to his limit, Jason decided to uncover the truth on his own. He bought a small surveillance camera and installed it in his apartment. Another one was discreetly hidden on his desk at the office. If someone really was watching him, these recordings would provide the proof he needed. For the first couple of days, everything seemed normal. The footage showed nothing unusual. His apartment was empty while he was at work, and his desk remained relatively undisturbed after hours. But on the third night, when Jason reviewed the footage from his apartment, he found something unsettling. At first, the video was routine. Jason sitting on the couch, eating dinner, and watching the news like he always did. But then, he noticed himself doing something strange. The Jason in the video suddenly went still, staring fixedly at a corner of the room. A corner that contained nothing but an old bookshelf. He sat like that, motionless, for nearly 15 minutes before standing up and walking out of the frame, as if compelled by an unseen force. What was even stranger was that, after leaving the frame, he didn't return for over an hour. The camera recorded the empty room in eerie silence before Jason reappeared, his face blank, sitting back down on the couch and turning on the TV as if nothing had happened. He had no memory of any of this. At the office, the footage from the hidden desk camera only deepened the mystery. It started normally, Jason typing, checking emails, and jotting down notes. But at one point he looked up, staring into space, and began muttering something inaudible. The truly disturbing part came moments later. In the far corner of the frame, a shadowy figure moved behind him. The figure moved slowly, deliberately. But when Jason turned around, there was no one there. Jason replayed the footage over and over, trying to make out more details, but the image was too blurry to identify who or what it was. Someone or something had been in his space. But why hadn't anyone else in the office noticed? Jason's fear and paranoia reached a breaking point. He began to suspect everyone around him, especially the co-workers who had always seemed friendly. One morning, unable to contain his frustration any longer, he confronted a group of them. "What are you doing? You know something, don't you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. His co-workers turned to him, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. No one responded at first, until one of them said, calmly but with a hint of unease, "Jason, you're not okay. Maybe you should take some time off." The words only fueled his frustration. "Time off? You want me to believe I'm crazy, don't you?" "But I'm not. I have proof," Jason shouted. But no matter what he said, no one seemed convinced. Instead, they quietly walked away, leaving Jason standing in the middle of the office, feeling as though his entire world was crumbling around him. That night, Jason went home and opened his laptop to review the footage again. He fast-forwarded to the part where the shadowy figure appeared behind him. But this time, the video file was gone. In its place, a single message appeared on the screen. "Stop looking, Jason." His chest tightened. Someone had accessed his system. Was this all an elaborate prank? Or was it part of a larger plan he couldn't comprehend? Jason sat frozen in front of his laptop, the weight of everything pressing down on him. It felt like he was sinking into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The next morning, Jason arrived at the office with a single-minded determination. He was going to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. He printed out stills from the surveillance footage, showing the shadowy figure, and brought them along. Without greeting anyone, he headed straight to the desks of the co-workers he suspected the most. "I want answers," Jason demanded, his voice steady but full of tension. He slapped the photos onto their table, pointing to the faint figure captured in the video. "Who is this? Why do I always feel like I'm being watched?" His co-workers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions shifting between confusion and concern. Finally, Lisa, one of the more outspoken members of the group, broke the silence. "Jason, there's no one there. We don't know what you're talking about." "Don't pretend," Jason's voice rose, nearly shouting. "You know. I know you know. I have proof." Lisa stood up, placing a hand gently on Jason's shoulder in an attempt to calm him. "Jason, you really need to take a break. You've been working too hard. We're worried about you." Her words only fueled Jason's frustration. He shook her hand off and stormed out of the office, leaving behind a room full of concerned stares. When he got home, something felt off. His apartment didn't look the same. Furniture was slightly out of place, as if someone had been inside while he was gone. Yet the door was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. As Jason stepped into the living room, his heart sank. The surveillance cameras he had set up were no longer in their positions. Instead, they lay scattered across the floor, dismantled. On the coffee table sat a small envelope. Jason picked it up, his hands trembling as he tore it open. Inside was a single slip of paper with a chilling message scrawled in messy handwriting. "Have you seen enough? We're always watching you. Jason felt his blood run cold. His eyes darted around the apartment, searching for any sign of who might have been there, but there was nothing. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Jason froze. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the faint glow of light streaming in through the window. The apartment across the way, the one where he'd often seen the shadowy figure, was lit up again. And there it was, a silhouette, faint but unmistakable, standing perfectly still, staring straight into his window. Gathering what courage he had left, Jason stepped out onto his balcony and yelled, "What do you want?" Who's behind all of this? No response. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, silent and motionless, like a lifeless mannequin. Jason retreated back into his apartment, slamming the door shut behind him. He sank to the floor, his head spinning. Was this all a cruel prank? Or was something far more sinister unfolding? A few days later, Jason received an email from HR. It was a termination notice. The official reason? Inappropriate behavior and causing disruptions in the workplace. He was instructed to pack his things and leave immediately. As he was clearing out his desk, Jason found a note tucked inside one of his drawers. It was written in the same eerie handwriting as the message in his apartment. "You'll never escape. We're always here." Jason stood frozen, the paper crumpling in his hand. That night, back in his apartment, Jason stood on his balcony, staring at the building across from him. The lights in the other apartment were still on, but this time there was no figure, no shadowy presence. And yet, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. As he stood there, the light in the apartment across the way suddenly blinked off, leaving him staring into complete darkness. Jason didn't move, his chest tightening as if the night itself was closing in around him. In that moment, he felt utterly alone, and yet he was certain someone, somewhere, was still watching.